Welcome to the Nervous System Care and Healing Podcast, where we talk about how to take care of ourselves in mind, in body, in spirit, while we navigate systems that were designed to keep us dysregulated. I'm your host, Liz, a neurodivergent therapist of color, and I'm really glad that you're here. Hey everyone. So, if you are someone who is interested in or invested in the idea of collective liberation and creating a more just and equitable world, but you're also like, what does that actually mean? And what does that look like in practice? How do I engage with this in a way that isn't totally overwhelming? I want to invite you to listen to this episode because I think it's going to add a really important piece and perspective to this larger conversation that I think we should all be having. And in this episode, my guest, Nicole, and I talk about why liberation and nervous system regulation are interconnected. So, liberation work and nervous system healing stuff are often treated as separate topics that happen in totally different spaces. But what if liberation is not something that we're chasing that's all the way over there? What if liberation is also a way of being that we can start to access in ourselves right now, while also working toward a change in our larger systems? So please keep listening for an insightful conversation on what liberation can look like in the nervous system, in the counseling room, and beyond. Hi, everyone. I'm very excited to introduce y'all to today's guest. So, Nicole Xenos is an LPC PhD Gestalt trained liberation therapist and supervisor working in Colorado. Nicole uses decolonial and anti-racist frameworks to provide education, counseling, and supervision in her communities. Nicole is a solo mom to 4 teenagers and identifies as an intersectional being. So, Nicole, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Liz.
Yeah. So, to start off our conversation, I would love to hear what brought you to liberation counseling and your practice, and why do you do this work?
Yeah, so that feels like a big question, but a great question. Liberation counseling can briefly be understood as really focusing on the needs to treat mental health as a social, political, and economic issue rather than just an individual issue, or kind of focusing on personal, just the need within the person, or just kind of their own, what can you do to be better, right? Or heal or fix, etc. And so I was first introduced to liberation counseling really in my doctoral program, my PhD program. We were assigned works by Paulo Freire, who is a philosopher that in the 70s that came up with the concept of critical consciousness, which is really the ability to recognize and analyze oppressive structures in our systems and society, and be able to take action against those. So once I started to learn about this critical consciousness, which is really about oppressed people being able to recognize that they're oppressed, right? I think sometimes there's a lack of recognition around what's happening and why and how that impacts us. But oppression can impact our overall well-being, our mental health, things like that. So there was something really powerful when I started to read about critical consciousness, which I think I had already really started to just come to on my own naturally. I've always been someone that questions authority and wants to kind of push
Yes.
back. And so there was something about that that felt really in alignment with me of like, okay, especially as a counselor, right? And someone in higher education, and they're telling you this is how it is and this is what it's supposed to be. And my natural inclination was to question that or say, well, maybe, or what about this? And so critical consciousness came in and really helped me to understand what I already knew about mental health as a counselor, that the outer world, especially our systems, and I think we can really all relate to the impact of government right now on just our well-being, that was a valid and real way to start to see counseling. And without looking at those pieces, we really are continuing to perpetuate those things, those same things,
Mhm.
right? If we're not willing to say, how does systemic oppression, racism, homophobia, sexism impact someone's mental well-being? If we're not really even being curious about those things, we are just unconsciously perpetuating them. So
Right.
that critical consciousness that I started to learn about in like a clinical framework really supported being able to move into like liberation counseling as feeling really in alignment with what I wanted to do as both a counselor, a
Mhm.
supervisor, a counselor educator. I would say that when I finished my master's degree,
Mhm.
I really identified as a social justice therapist. And I
Mhm.
really went, that felt really in alignment with me, with feeling like therapy, counseling was a place that we needed to do advocacy and allyship and work against the status quo and stand up for our clients that were marginalized and oppressed. And I definitely still hold those practices. I think social justice is part of counseling inherently. It's part of our code of ethics. It's something we're
Mhm.
called to do when we choose to be counselors. But liberation to me took it beyond like expecting the systems to change or focusing so much on
Mm.
change within systems, right? Oh, well, if
Mm.
I can change the system or if I can advocate, and there's power in that, we should still do that. But I think for me, that can sometimes bring in some feelings of hopelessness or helplessness when we like don't have that ability. But with liberation, it's within us. Of course, there's
Mm.
the outer parts of like doing the work and advocating and being in the socio-political climate and really making change, but it's less focused on the system will change. We'll do this and the system will have
Mm.
to respond,
Mm.
because that's not always true. And I think it can really, for me, it was creating a lot of heaviness and feelings of like, what can I do then? And so discovering liberation counseling and just the framework and the principles was really supportive to me, and like kind of evolving a little bit further. It's not that social justice therapy was bad or not valid, but that I needed a little bit more, and
Yeah.
I found that in liberation counseling. Yeah.
Yeah. And that seems, I mean, that seems more hopeful to know that liberation can be available within ourselves and our own being, and that it's not solely dependent on waiting for these archaic systems to change, that it can be a both and we can also have
Hmm.
that inner experience of liberation.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And something that caught my attention is when you said sometimes people who are oppressed don't know that they're oppressed. And I'm curious if you could share more about that, of what that is like to be oppressed and but to not be aware of it, and what does it look like when one starts to become aware of that?
There's a couple different examples I could use. We're not saying any one group or any one person is
Mhm.
inherently bad. Not understanding our oppression is not on our own lack, right? It's
Mhm.
just the reality of
Yeah.
conditioning. And I would say we might see this in our current political climate feels so accessible, because I think it's so much of what I see in counseling is a lot of distress, a lot of fear around
Mhm.
what's happening, how
Mhm.
laws impact us. And I think oftentimes some of us can see people say, like, there's people that are like women for Trump, or right, different types of groups that are still wanting to support something that is inherently oppressing them, right? We can see the Trump administration just factually stripping women's rights, changing
Mhm.
laws there. And to
Yeah.
have women that are explicitly saying, I stand with this person and I support this person, to me is a form of internalized oppression, right? To
Yeah.
just kind of continue to say, well, I'm special, or let me try to move around this. And I think identities are a lot of at play there. But sometimes I try to hold that bigger perspective of like, there's some safety in that. There's safety in not being willing to look at our own oppression, or there's some comfort. It is hard to start to really open our eyes or wake up, or however you want to kind of, whatever terminology you use, to see oppression is not usually enjoyable or comfortable, right? It's very painful, and it can be heartbreaking. It can be shocking if we haven't really started to look at it. So that's kind of one example of where I could see someone that hasn't right developed that critical consciousness to start to both see, wow, I'm being oppressed here, and analyze, like, what does that mean for me? Right? It's comfort, it's lack of ability, it's like maybe we're in a trauma response, right? It can be hard to go into these deeper things. So that's one example. And the other example I'll use is just in my own like clinical work and my expertise as someone that has worked in domestic violence for a long time, and primarily within like psychological abuse or narcissistic abuse, as some people call it. So
Yeah.
I can really see that internalized oppression showing up and not understanding like what's happening there and the systems of abuse. So I think there's like we can look at this really big systemically, but I really love that for me, liberation counseling has been a huge source of support in working with people that are coming out of psychological abuse, because there's a similar like conditioning and belief system that's really been ingrained in someone, and it impacts their mental health. So that's kind of that first piece to your question of just like, what does that look like? And it looks like
Yeah.
someone that's just really trying their best, maybe trying to heal from a place of like not from self, right? Like,
Hmm.
I am flawed. I should do something differently here. Or why can't I be a certain way? Whatever stories are there.
Hmm.
And what I notice when someone starts to kind of step out of that space or wake up to their own critical consciousness and be a little bit curious about like, oh, wait, is that fair? Or how does this impact my mental health, rather than just accepting that? To me, there's usually a point of like recognition I notice where there's like oh, this is not something I've considered before. And usually, or in my hope is it's a little bit slow. It's
Hmm.
not, it can be very jarring. It can be a lot
Yeah.
to start to unpack, decondition
Yeah.
so many layers of what we believe about ourselves, especially depending on our identities. It's, to me, almost like watching a return to self in a beautiful way of like taking away what we've been told about who we are.
Yeah.
And I can definitely relate to that in my own experience. It's like seeing someone heal by just returning to self, not necessarily because they need to fix or do something differently, but they're allowing their true self to be present, is really what it like
Yeah.
looks like to me and in the
Yeah.
work. Yeah.
Yeah. And and that's beautiful. That returning to self and shedding the layers of messages of what we may have been told about ourselves or our worth or who gets to have what, but really that coming back to self.
Yeah.
And I think it's a really good point that it's actually helpful if this process isn't an overnight, like, crashing realization, because that would be a lot to process and integrate, but that it may happen slowly over time, and it can
Hmm.
start with just that seed being planted of, "Wait, this isn't fair. Is this fair? I don't know if I wanna accept this," and seeing that there's more to the context.
Hmm. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Not just about what you did or didn't do. Right. Because I think in
Yeah.
our society or culture, we have a lot of still that messaging of like, pick yourself up by the bootstraps, or why didn't you
Exactly.
just do something
Mhm.
differently? And it's easy to blame yourself or feel guilt
Yeah.
around what you haven't done.
Yeah.
And there's some freedom in letting it be seen that that's not just an individual failure, right? But it's a
Exactly.
systemic, it's oppression, and it's meant to be doing this, can be very freeing to start to come to terms with, although that
Yeah.
doesn't mean it feels good all the time. So,
Totally.
yeah.
Yeah. And I'd I'd love to hear more about what a liberation focused counseling session might look like. What yeah, and I'm sure it's so different with each person, with each session, but in general, I'm curious what you're seeing and experiencing in your
Hmm.
work.
Well, yeah, like you said, it's gonna look different for every liberation counselor or someone that identifies like that, and I would say that for me, it really starts with, like, my base, my Gestalt training and, like, what that looks like in session, and Gestalt is really focused on mind and body connection, present moment awareness. I love that Gestalt is really based on, like, relationship, and sometimes it's referred to as, like, relational meditation, but being able
Yes.
to just be with someone in this very present moment space, I think is a really great base to moving into liberation practices, right? Being able to be with what is right now versus, well, what does everything outside say about who we are and what we're doing here? So
Yeah.
that feels really supportive, especially in when terms of like liberation and just coming to see these things can be really dysregulating, right? So when we
Yeah.
talk about like regulation, how I really find that the Gestalt base and home of like the somatic sensations and like what's happening in my mind and body, really reinforcing that, building like some base of regulation can be supportive to exploring these kind of difficult topics. And in the room, it can really look like a lot of things. It depends on the client and where they're at in their process. I would say actively, it looks like we're talking about something, right? Some issue or some kind of personal thing. And for me, because of that development of critical consciousness and my awareness around the systems and the impact of that, it's bringing that in, right? It's reflecting
Yeah.
that, or it's really providing maybe psychoeducation to start out with of like, hey, this is the impact of actually racism and even like microaggressions on someone's
Yeah.
system. And so
Yeah.
having some, I think my initial basis of like, first it was like cultural reflexivity, and then it was
Yeah.
social justice, and then
Mhm.
liberation. They've all really overlaid on each other to make it feel for me a lot more grounded in like a lot of like research. And yes, sometimes it's just in personal experience and being able to connect around what we both, maybe two people in the room, have shared and felt. And that can be really validating in itself. So I think
Yeah.
it really looks like this slow, gentle, hopefully compassionate process of supporting a client in their own critical consciousness, the
Yeah.
development of them recognizing like, you know, for me, there was many layers of developing this. Like I was raised very religious. And so coming to understand what and how religious conditioning really impacted my sense of self and who I
Mhm.
was and all of that took time. And
Mhm.
so that was kind of my first little like, oh, I don't, know if I truly believe this. I don't know if this aligns with my values and who I am. And so for many clients, I find that there's usually an area that we start to be curious about, and that inherently naturally can kind of develop this critical consciousness across many spaces, right? And that can take years. And I'd say for me, it took years to allow this deconditioning or deprogramming, unlearning, however you want to, decolonizing of each aspect of my life, and then how they like fit in together. So to me, there's no rush because integration is so important, and that regulation and being able to
Yeah.
care for yourself, especially because our oppressive systems don't want that. So how do we actively
Exactly.
practice that in the room as well, of saying we have time, we have space, because our culture's so like, you don't have time, you don't have space, hustle,
Right.
grind. And so even just the practices of how we're holding the space can be, to me, liberation or
Yeah.
liberatory. Yeah.
Well, I love that the way in which the processing happens slow and gentle and compassionate, that in and of itself is liberating because it is so different from this rushed, urgent, panicked pace that oppressive systems was to be functioning under. I also
Exactly.
really appreciate what you said about there needs to be a base of regulation in order to engage in this work and developing that critical consciousness. And it just reminds me of how like this work needs to be embodied. It can't just
Hmm.
be like, here are facts and like we're just gonna swallow all this information whole and like not actually feel how it impacts us. And I also appreciate that this work sounds relational, that it's happening in the
Hmm.
context of this hopefully safe therapeutic relationship.
Yeah, exactly. And because we can't also ignore the fact that therapy is an institution, right? It's housed within Western medicine, the medical model. Even if we have slightly different ways of working, we have to acknowledge that. And I think acknowledging power dynamics and hierarchy and creating this relational space of this also could be a place where you feel these things. And I want this place to be able to be a place of exploration with that. And hopefully we can name it or just notice, because yeah, as I kind of have started recently working with insurance clients, right? I didn't for a while because of the way I work and really my own resistance to that. But coming into it and recognizing and naming it in those spaces of like, to give someone a diagnosis upon first meeting them doesn't necessarily feel liberatory. And I want to be honest about that, and us having this open dialogue. But how can we do this in the least harmful and least oppressive way as possible to get our needs met? So there's some like real life practices that can happen in that space. It's not just removed, because therapy itself is one of those spaces, or it can be.
Yeah. And that's such a great example of how there's such a different energy between in that insurance-based context of just like slapping a diagnosis onto the
Hmm.
client experience and not having that conversation of like, here's what that means and here, right? Versus like, hey, I want to acknowledge that this is all happening within a system that might feel not good to be in, or maybe it's fine for some people, but like to have that conversation about the elephant in the room, that the system is kind of this invisible third presence. What I notice is that like my body feels some more relief just hearing someone name that. It doesn't take away that there is an oppressive system, but it kind of shows me, okay, someone's in my corner and someone's on my team and sees it for what it is as well.
Hmm. Yeah. And for me, liberation counseling is such a like personal practice as well in the space, or just liberation. And it feels important to name that and like also attune to and recognize like the impact of diagnosis on someone's lived experience and depending on their identities and where these things go and why they're being used. And is that of benefit to the client? While we might still have to do it, I'd like to lessen some of that power differential or come back to what our, our core counseling ethics of autonomy and fidelity to the client. Like liberation counseling to me naturally goes with those things. So I think that's why it feels really good for me. I still know that I'm in my own ethics as a counselor and that we do have things that we have to hold even within these systems so we can
Yeah.
meet needs and we can practice and hopefully support folks within these systems, which is what counseling exists in, whether we like it or not.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And speaking of, the identities, just the unique multifacetedness of each experience, I want to ask how do your identities and personal experiences influence your work in this field?
Hmm. Yeah. I think my own personal experiences of what liberation has meant for me, what that looks like. As I kind of said earlier, religion, I think, and stepping away from that and being curious about that outside of what I've been told about who I should be, what I should be, was a really powerful place of like beginning to explore that and recognizing it. I would say that I was really first introduced to liberation practices without even really understanding it about maybe 13, 15 years ago. I did a trauma informed yoga teacher training through
Hmm.
a project called Prison Yoga Project. And it was before I was a counselor, all these things, but really it was like doing yoga and learning how to do yoga in a trauma informed way, right? For people that maybe don't feel as comfortable in a studio or haven't historically seen themselves in these spaces that have really been taken over and away from their like original place. They talked a lot about basically healing being an inside job, right? And in the sense of like Prison Yoga Project, this is people that really are physically imprisoned. They cannot
Hmm.
leave. They can't. How can
Yeah.
you work with someone and support their healing when they have so little choice, so little
Yeah.
autonomy and agency? And so that was kind of the first window into like, wow, how important, right? What
Hmm.
important work to be able to meet people where they're at literally in so many ways. And
Yeah.
so that was kind of the first taste of what that could mean in the work. And that really brought me to a lot of my own deconditioning that I was already working on. And I think the other couple layers that feel important is just like as a multi-ethnic, multiracial person
Hmm.
myself, the conditioning and stories I'd always heard in my life of like, you're not enough for either space, right? You're
Mm.
not Filipino enough in my case, you're not white enough, I wasn't able to, I always felt like there was oppression in the sense of like, I need to be a certain way, right? And then being raised religious as a woman has a lot of
Hmm.
different, like what you are supposed to be.
Totally. Hmm.
Yeah. So I think all of that as I began to step away and really, like I said, develop critical consciousness, it naturally kind of flowed into releasing these stories and starting to understand the impact on my mental health and my own autonomy and agency
Yeah.
and choice in that, which is really empowering when you
Hmm.
feel like you don't have a lot of freedom, choice, etc.
Yeah.
So that was a little bit of that personal journey. And while it's both inside and outside systems, is then in my work in domestic violence and my
Yeah.
own kind of experiences of psychological abuse is like recognizing the
Hmm.
high levels of conditioning, right? When we think of like something like gaslighting, it's literally made to the the desires to make you question your own reality. That's a pretty
Yeah.
heavy, big thing. And so
Hmm.
liberation to me is really taking away the stories that I was told as someone that was being abused about my worthiness, about who I was,
Hmm.
and being able to recognize like them for what they were, right? Separately of myself, like these are means of control, manipulation, and meant to oppress you. And
Hmm.
so there's something really empowering about being able to separate myself and see these dynamics a little bit more factually, which for me is really supportive. Maybe not for
Hmm.
everyone, but I think seeing
Hmm.
this as like a system, another type of
Hmm.
system, especially
Yeah.
the dynamics of power control, liberation practices to me are a huge part of being able to come back to self, especially when you're
Hmm.
being gaslit or been told you don't know yourself, which I think is
Hmm.
inherently happening in the bigger, wider institutions as well. Our institutions perpetuate that is acceptable, right? Our
Exactly.
institutions, we see that. Yeah.
Exactly, at the macro level and the micro level, and
Hmm.
yeah, and that definition of gaslighting as making someone doubt their own reality, it happens systemically and in these
Exactly.
interpersonal interactions as well.
Hmm.
I have a question. So if someone
Hmm.
were to say, "I wanna come back to myself, but I don't know how would you support them through that?
Mm. Yeah. Hmm. Well, that always feels like a big question because, of course, it's different for everyone. But I would say that if this was a client I was working with, it would just be beginning to be curious about like what's gonna work for you. I definitely recommend a lot of journaling
Mhm.
practices that bring you
Yeah,
to self without
yeah.
other people's opinion or voice. And even in counseling, right? There's still
Mhm.
me there. There's still another person. So I really encourage people journaling, like what's happening for me right now without someone else telling me what's happening, because that
Yeah,
is a big part of it, right? We always are
yeah.
looking to something else to kind of confirm or validate, which is a human experience. But when we've done that and it's been used against us, right? Manipulate, if we're looking to someone and they're giving us misinformation or they're leading us to doubt ourselves, that's concerning. So
Mhm.
journaling, self-reflective practices like meditation, right? Yoga,
Mhm.
being able to be with your own experience. I really believe in the power of like the mind body connection. So
Yeah,
somatics and being able to say, oh, I'm noticing tightness in my chest. What's happening for me here, slowing down. So I think
yeah,
regulation is a huge part of like coming
yeah.
to self. Maybe it's self-reflective practices or self-inquiry of like me. What do I notice about myself? What do I notice about my beliefs? If I
Yeah,
think like, oh, I'm bad, slowing that down even more and being curious about like, where's that voice coming from? What's
yeah,
happening here? Right. Because my belief is that inherently we want what's best for ourselves. We don't
yeah.
naturally come to this world just thinking all of these horrible things. They've been taught to us and they've been really programmed into us. And so as we can separate the voices that we think are ourselves, because so many people
Mhm.
will say, oh, well, that's just me. And I'm like, but we don't want those things for ourselves naturally. It's not norm. I won't say normal. It's something we all do, but it's really oppressive when we in our
Yeah.
own minds are saying how horrible we are, how much we're not doing, et cetera. It's like the system to me, it's just that internalized oppression just doing its job, right? It doesn't need to do anything anymore because we will
Mm,
do it for ourselves. So combating that through like self-care, journaling, really what is happening here is really where I start with everyone. And I think then it naturally unfolds into their own understanding or their own practices and we just reinforce it, right? Because we all have our own things that we need. We have our own ways of being, our own, ancestral practices, our own lineages that we have to attend to that are going to be different for all of us. So it's very open, but I think that's the beginning part is like, what's
yeah,
happening in me in all of the ways? What do I notice? How can I meet myself without judgment just to begin with, if we can. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Mm.
And what I keep noticing is how so much of this is the unlearning and the deconditioning and just pulling off what's been like stuck onto us and just finding what was there before
Mhm.
the systems told us who we were.
Yeah.
And some things shouldn't be normal, but they've become normalized. And just because it's normalized to think that some people are more worthy of or than others or whatever the systems say
Mhm.
doesn't make it okay. So I just
Yes.
want to like highlight that as well, that some things are so commonplace that we don't even question it. But then when we start to question, it's like, whoa, that's really messed up.
Mhm.
Let's unpack that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's making me kind of I work with a lot of people that are children of immigrants,
Mm.
and I would say there's something really beautiful about as they develop, or I even can reference myself, like develop critical consciousness around how has all of these things impacted my mental health, right? My own well-being has really provided a lot of compassion for my parents, right? Or my grandparents, how they were forced to kind of be in this world. And I think that I've seen that be really powerful and like making sense, like sense making, right? Working with children of immigrants that really have been hurt by their parents or really notice like, wow, these things are painful. And it's not to say that there's no accountability, but that there's a space to understand like maybe their responses were in regards to this system that they were entering as immigrants and had to kind of adjust to harshly or figure out a way to cope and survive. And it's not that it then means no, okay, well, we have to excuse it, but more so that we can find some space and find a little bit of room to move within that. And I've witnessed that feel really healing for people. And I've also felt that myself. When we can provide that, I think, to others, or we can allow that space, I think it inherently comes to us and vice versa, right? We can give ourselves a little bit more, and then we can maybe meet someone on the street that we don't know and understand, ooh, what could be the impact of the systems right now as we see people struggle with, medical care, mental health care, being able to obtain
Yeah.
education, or just any kind of housing security. I think it helps us to see there's like a collective healing, right?
Hmm.
Liberation is not individual. There's some
Yeah.
individual work here, and we can start here. And I think
Yeah.
it's so important, but it really is collective. And
Yeah.
so how do we see that spreading out into the ways that we meet others, I think is powerful. It
Yeah.
is healing that's not just always that linear or, recordable in a nice little note.
Yeah. Totally. Yeah. And I love that this work, starts with the individual, but it does not stay there. It's meant to be collective and have this ripple effect. Yeah.
Yeah.
So my next question is, since we're kind of talking about liberation, how there needs to be a base of nervous system regulation to do this work, I wonder if you could share more of how liberation and nervous system health or regulation are connected.
My belief is that without really a focus on liberation in counseling to some degree, that therapy as a practice just reinforces a status quo, right? If we are really anxious about the state of the world and we're not willing to be critical of that and analyze and say like, okay, that is fair. And how does that impact us, right? If all of these laws regulating our identities and bodies are happening, it makes sense that we're feeling dysregulation, right? It's
Yes.
fearful and it's trauma. And
Yeah.
so I think that we have to bring liberation in order to really even start to have a base of regulation in some ways. Because if we're just trying to tend to these symptoms
Hmm.
of anxiety because of the world, which is very fair, without going a little deeper to like, these systems are oppressive and this isn't okay, right? And really naming them and letting them be in the light, then how would we ever be able to regulate ourselves through that? And regulation can be so dependent on external sources, right? Like do we have our basic needs met? If we don't,
Hmm.
regulation might be a little bit harder. And
Yeah.
so being willing to address and like recognize the impact of society and the systems can help us to take some of the pressure off of ourselves to just regulate and like, oh, I just need
Yeah.
to personally learn how to breathe through every
Yeah.
difficult thing that I'm seeing.
Yeah.
Uh, it feels like so daunting. I speak a lot to like survivors of psychological abuse and that are still having to be in contact with their abusers because of children or whatever other reasons. And we often talk about how difficult it is to regulate when we're still experiencing the trauma on a daily basis, right? And
Hmm.
I think right now we're living in that kind of space.
Hmm.
Really hard to regulate and be like, it's okay, I'm safe, when the news is like saying, no, you're not. Or
Hmm.
we see all of these things happening that make us feel like I'm not inherently safe. There's something I think liberating about seeing that for what it is. and and potentially again it's like that, making a little bit of space of like, how can I tend to myself as also an act of liberation, an act
Yeah.
of social justice, to say like, these systems want me to feel a certain way, and
Hmm.
there's something empowering about not. And there's something empowering
Exactly.
about taking ownership of like,
Yeah.
I know this is what you want me to feel and I'm not going to do that anymore, is
Hmm.
really
Yeah.
can feel great when we don't have a lot of
Yeah.
control in a lot of other spaces.
Yeah. And I love that approach. It really helps
Mhm.
me when I can know that the systems actually don't want me or us to feel good, than to actually pursue experiences that feel good, joy and pleasure and play.
Mhm.
It's like this act of resistance as well.
Exactly. Even the practices in the room, right, I think are what
Yeah.
allow us to then move into that deeper space because we know about trauma and trauma responses that when we're really feeling all of that, it's really hard to come to like, let me be curious here and let me do this like deeper work because we're just not able to get to that spot. So I think just
Yeah.
supporting that, and that might take time, right? And that's okay.
Yeah. Well, as we're starting to wrap up here, I just want to say I really appreciate how you have describe this liberation work as both like, yes, it's going to be uncomfortable and even painful and difficult. We're not saying it's not going to be that, but there is absolutely room for you to feel good in this. Like, and
Mhm.
actually, the point is for us to feel good and arrive at like liberation in ourselves and like that felt sense of whether it's joy or just connection, or a true knowing and remembering who we are. So I love that you
Mhm.
don't sugarcoat it, but that it's not just this like, oh, and this is going to be horrible the whole time. Like that, like
Oh,
for
for
this work to
sure.
be sustainable, it actually has to like feel resourcing too.
Mhm. And
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
And I'll say that, yeah, a lot of my clients and I talk about that, that it is hard to open our eyes, see what is, and really be present with it. And clients will say that, right? I'll say that, like, "Ugh, it kind of is hard if I could just go back to sleep or if I just could close my eyes." But then when we really have that conversation, every person is like, "I don't want that though." Like, I think there's the reality that this feels better in the sense that I no longer blame myself as much. I no longer hold all my, problems or deficiencies or whatever as a personal failing in some ways. And
Yeah.
that to me indicates that yes, it is laborious, right? There is something there. But yeah, like you said, moments of joy and what feels like freedom from the conditioning and the oppression is
Yeah.
more than worthwhile for anyone I know
Yeah.
that's really engaged in it. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And that they cannot take away our consciousness, our critical
Mhm.
consciousness. Yeah.
And they'll
Yeah.
try. So
Yeah,
this
they
is why
will. That,
it's
yep.
so yeah.
Yep.
And that's
Yes.
why it's so important, especially in this space to be, and same as counselor education and supervision. And they all to me are connected, being a mother, right? Helping my
Yeah.
children understand themselves is collective work.
Yes.
So I think we can all be
Beautiful.
doing this work in whichever way that we have access to and ability to. Yeah.
Beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, final couple questions here, Nicole. What is one way you like to take care of your nervous system?
Yes, I like a lot of things, but I would say right now I really love live music. I really
Yeah.
love I'm a musician. I've been a musician a lot of my life, so really feeling music in my body and then being able to move without yeah, it's liberating. I don't feel like I have to be any kind of way when I'm enjoying music and being present and I allow my body to move and it feels like a safe space because most people are doing that. So right now that's been my like especially in nature. So live music in nature is like heaven right now for me. Yeah.
Wow. Amazing. It's both
Mm-mm.
like self-regulatory, but also that co-regulation and like sharing
Yes.
space with other
Yes.
nervous systems. Love
Mhm.
that.
Yeah.
Listeners who would like to stay in touch with you or interested in working with you, could you tell us about that?
I do have a website. It's www.paintedonehealing.com. And I have information there. I've started to blog. If you're interested in my musings of any kind, we have the blog there, and people can reach out if you are interested in supervision or counseling or consultation. If you're already licensed and just curious to like, how do I deepen my work in liberation in counseling? I love to talk about these things. So, yeah, I'm available and I love to engage with the community.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you, Nicole. And we'll have all of that info in the show notes for anyone interested in learning more. And thank you so much for this
Yeah.
really enlightening and also empowering conversation.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Liz. It was great being here with you.
Thank you so much for listening to the Nervous System Care and Healing podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to follow or subscribe on whatever platform you use to listen to podcasts. And if you ever have a few minutes to leave a rating and review, it would mean so much to me, and it helps other people to find the podcast and spread the care. Please remember that this podcast is not a replacement for therapy, coaching, or professional mental health services. The information shared here is generalized, it may not reflect every individual nuance, and it should not be interpreted as personalized mental health advice. So please do seek out additional support if you need it. Take care and be well. This is Liz at Nervous System Care and Healing.